So a lot of people have been criticizing Pokemon Scarlet and Violet for its frame rate issues, and fair cop, but I think people don't have a good idea of what in gaming takes a lot of resources and doesn't in terms of rendering it on screen. So there's an analogy I like to use. Imagine any scene in a game is playing out on your tabletop, like it was a board game or a role-playing session or something like that. And you're using miniatures to represent everything. And all you have to make the scene work are your two hands. The more you have to move stuff around, the longer it's going to take to set that scene. So in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, with all of these wild Pokemon walking around on the map and persisting even when you're in battle, think about what it would be like to set that scene with your own two hands. You have this group of flying Pokemon you have to move around. You have this other Pokemon that's wandering through. You have your character. You have the NPCs. You have your character's Pokemon. You have the environmental elements, like if wind is blowing through the trees or moving something. If you had to move all those miniatures yourself, you would be really taxed. And so the game is really taxing on the Switch hardware, which, by the way, is a potato. It is essentially 2 generations old. It has no business running games like this. And a lot of people bring up, well, what about Super Mario Odyssey or Breath of the Wild or even stuff like The Witcher? Think about normal scenes in The Witcher. A lot of times it's just Geralt and, I don't know, 2 or 3 enemies. That, even though it looks really good, doesn't take a whole lot of power. You wouldn't struggle setting that scene with just 2 hands. Mario Odyssey, even easier. Very few enemies are on screen at once. Very few things are moving on screen at once. It's a platformer, so the stages are usually figured out. They're mostly flat. Mario Odyssey is very low poly and doesn't need a whole lot of logic to make its stages work. I feel like it's also worth noting that Breath of the Wild also had frame rate issues, but it too had relatively few things on screen at once. At most, Link would have to deal with 4 or 5 enemies. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet is doing a lot for not a whole lot of graphical return. Now, you can make arguments about whether or not they should have done that, like maybe it would have been better to just have random encounters so that the game moves smoother instead of putting all the Pokemon on the map like people said they wanted. And that's all a matter of design philosophy. But for the people who are like, why can't they just patch this? Why aren't they just programming it better? You literally can't just program it better. There are real hardware limitations here, and Nintendo was developing this on, I think, a 3-year timescale and a really massive budget. Game Freak employs like 100 people. It's not like those 100 people were all just sleeping at their desk. Nintendo made a decision. Were they going to prioritize gameplay or were they going to prioritize performance? And they chose gameplay, and we'll just have to see if that was the correct choice. But I think it probably was, because like the families and 5-year-olds that are playing Pokemon probably don't care about frame rate issues.